the third lecture on Chapter 1, we're going to talk about, again, a null. And I'm going to express this as my null. My null consists of 4 green dots or candies and 1 yellow candy in this bag. So my alternative hypothesis then would be there is not 4 green and 1 yellow. So what we're going to do is we're going to gather evidence to test the hypothesis. So to gather evidence in this bag, I'm just going to reach in and I'm going to pull one out. Looks like I got a yellow. That is possible. I'm okay with that, but it's not real likely when I have 4 green and 1 yellow, but it is possible. So I'm going to replace the yellow. I'm going to reach in and grab again. Oh, I got a second yellow. So now I have 2 yellow. A little less likely, but still possible, because there is still 1 yellow in the bag. I replace the yellow. I'm going to reach in a third time. Reaching in my third time, I again grab out a yellow. So I'm consistently gathering yellow when there's only supposed to be 1 in the bag, and 4 green. So you would think of the 3 times I've drawn, I should have gotten a green out. So we've gathered evidence. So in looking at these hypotheses, what I'm going to do, I'm going to make a decision. Based on the evidence, the data I gathered, it looks like we're going to reject the null based on my evidence. Could I have made a mistake? Sure, I could have reached in and grabbed a yellow out each and every time because there was 1 in there and I kept replacing it. Well, we have a name for this and we call it statistically significant. And that happens when the data or the evidence that you have gathered is unlikely. Notice it's still possible, but it's unlikely given the null is true. Now, when we say this a given, we're assuming. This is an assumption. I don't know for sure. That's why I gathered the evidence. When this happens, we say it is statistically significant. And I always like to rephrase this, and I always call it is significant enough to make a change. And when we say that we're going to make a change, that means we're going to reject the null. So when you read this phrase in a statistical study and it says it is statistically significant, what they're saying is the data was significant enough of a difference from what I was told would be in there that I'm going to reject the null. Now there's a let's do it on page 10. It has to do with gathering data on some potato chips. And in bold it says it was statistically significant. As soon as you read that, you need to realize that your null hypothesis was rejected. Was a complaint registered with the supplier? It should be. And we'll find out a little bit more about that later on in the course. Could there have been a mistake? If so, describe. Yes, there could have been a mistake. We only sampled 1 box. Maybe the heavier bags fell to the bottom. We never can be sure unless we can take a look at the entire population, which is pretty much unrealistic. Just a little extension onto the activity. If the average weight of the chip bags selected was 13 ounces, and again they were supposed to be 16 ounces, which hypothesis would you support? Well, I would again reject the null. The evidence shows that it's quite a bit different than 16 ounces. What if the weight in there had been 15.9? All the evidence I gathered was 15.9 ounces. Well, that's very close to 16 ounces. So most likely I would support the null. It's not that much of a difference. So I would continue to support the null. So what you need to remember here is the burden of proof. The proof that's going to help me make my decision comes from within the data. The data is your evidence. For me to reject the null, That's a very strong statement. So we want to make sure that when I reject, that I'm pretty certain that the null is false. Remember, we could make some errors because we're only looking at a sample. The types of errors that we could make are type 1 and type 2. A type 1 error is when you reject the null when it's actually true. And a type 2 then is when you fail to reject the null. Sometimes we say this is accepting the null, but statistical language says that we should say fail to reject the null when the null is actually false. Now, we'll never know if we made an error for sure unless we're able to look at the entire population. A great example of this is just our legal system. When we say defendant in our legal system, we are to assume that that defendant is innocent. And so the alternative then is that they are guilty. Just the opposite. So the consequence of a type 1 error. A type 1 error is I reject the null, so I'm rejecting that they're innocent and saying they're guilty, but I made a mistake. They're really innocent. So what we've done is we've accused an innocent person. And we've sent them to prison when actually they were innocent. Consequence of a type 2 is we failed to reject, so we are accepting that they are innocent when in fact they're not. So what happens there is a guilty person is set free. There are some let's do it to practice this idea of a type 1 and type 2 error. This will be a separate lecture in itself. So let's go down to level of significance. The level of significance is going to be the chance of committing a type 1 error. Obviously, we want that chance to be small. So the size of that chance is going to either be a 10% chance, which is fairly large, a 5% chance, or a 1%. Now, these are common levels of significance. We want them to be small. The symbol for the level of significance is this letter that almost looks like a little fish, and it's called alpha. So we will set alpha before we ever begin the process, so we know when we can reject and not, and that will come in chapter 10. So establishing the level of significance is kind of a management position or decision. It's made by the researcher, and it's always made before they ever start collecting their evidence. So the lecture for the Let's Do It 1.5 on page 13 follows.